Farwell, and I am, like I said, a board member of the Green Mountain Conservancy, and I want to just introduce what this project is and why we're having an information meeting about it. This started in the fall of 2018 with a parcel of land that had been on the market in the northwest corner of Dummerston. So this is pretty small for most of you to see, but we've got the town line between Newfane and Dummerston, and Brookline and Dummerston. There's Putney, Newfane, Brookline, Dummerston. And so right in the corner, this red 287 acre parcel was on the market, and an ad hoc group of many of them neighbors to that land who knew it well, and spearheaded by Mary Ellen Copeland and Ed Antes, kind of pulled themselves together and said, boy, wouldn't it be nice if some conservation mission nonprofit bought that land, because that's really what should happen here. And we had a number of meetings. We talked about maybe the Nature Conservancy, threw out some other organizations. Who would be interested? Long story short, if you want to get a job done, you have to do it yourself. We formed our own nonprofit. There actually was an existing nonprofit called the Green Mountain Conservancy. They had kind of fallen into inaction, and a number of their board members had left, so it was an opportunity for us to repopulate the board. The mission was exactly what we wanted it to be, to conserve land. And so we were, we had our nonprofit. We held a meeting just like this one in the Dummerston Community Center a year ago, 2018 December, where we told the community about what we wanted to do. And we had just signed with the owner of that parcel, Alex Wilson and his brother, a purchase and sale. So we, starting with that meeting, we proceeded to raise money and apply to grants to try to see if we could, in the 12 months we had, meet our goal. The owner had given us a 10% discount off the appraised value as a starting point. So we felt we had a good price to work with. We went to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which oversees a fund that is, it's funded by the real estate transfer tax in Vermont, and is set up by statute to fund just this kind of land conservation project, as well as affordable housing. It's an interesting marriage, but a large percentage of that fund goes to affordable housing, and something like 15%, I don't know exactly, goes towards land conservation. And we applied for funding to them. And they loved it. So in last March, we applied, we presented to the board, and you present to the board and they tell you at the end of the day what you've got. And we got about 3/4 of what we needed. And for the rest of the year, we held fundraising events. We applied to other smaller foundations. Wyndham Foundation gave us $5,000, and it started to add up. And at a certain point, near the end of the summer, we realized we had just enough. And so we've been going through the process of all the necessary paperwork to meet Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and Vermont Land Trust requirements for the conservation easement that Vermont Land Trust is putting on the land at the same time that we closed. And that was quite a learning process, a lot of hoops to jump through, and just yesterday we closed. So, it's been a busy year. It's been very exciting. There's been a very steep learning curve, but I want to tell you more about the actual land and why we think this is a great project, and then also get on to the actual land that's in Newfane and Brookline. Just to get past this map, to orient everybody, those of you who aren't familiar, here's the West River and Route 30. Route 30 is the red line, and West River coming down right around Newfane Village. Route 30 takes a shortcut past this bend in the river. And the river comes down and joins with Grassy Brook and hits the Putney Mountain Ridge, which is running more or less north-south between Brookline and Putney. And when the West River hits it, it has to take this hard right and basically circle around the end of that Putney Mountain Ridge. And when it gets back to where it was trying to get to, it takes a hard right again and goes right back. You can almost put a ruler straight. It's as if it remembered where it wanted to be. But I like that because it defines the land that we are conserving. It's that land that the river's trying to get around. Like I said, the red land is 287 acres. That's what we have managed to purchase as of yesterday. Two other abutting landowners, board members, are also putting their own lands under a Vermont Land Trust conservation easement as well, which makes the land contiguous right down to the West River. There is a major drainage of all this land that comes into a ravine that drains basically this whole watershed down to the West River. So it's kind of satisfying to have that entire watershed conserved. At the same time, a year ago, Maple Valley sold, and we realized that the Mercedes family was beginning to lose interest in all this land that they had in Vermont. And so we contacted them, and indeed they were very interested in a buyer for the land on the other side of the mountain, which is 630 acres. It was in 3 different parcels, but they all abut this Dummerston parcel. So the two of them together came very close to 1,000 acres, and that was both sides of Putney Mountain. And this Mercedes-owned land is 2.5 miles of West River frontage. So that seemed, that's really when I got excited about the project, when I realized that they were interested in selling, because the 2 parcels together would create 1,000 acres of contiguous conserved land, and you don't see that so often. And as its proximity to the rest of the Putney Mountain Ridge with the conserved lands there, and its being right on the shore of West River, the possibilities for wildlife corridor were very real. And so that's when I got excited, and over the past year we've been having many meetings and conversations with the Mercedes family. They got quite interested in seeing that land conserved, to the extent that they even supported what we call phase 1, supported the first purchase with a financial contribution, and they agreed to the same 10% off appraised value price with us. And so we went ahead and got the appraisal, and last month in November we signed a purchase and sale with them. So that's now a new goal for us as far as fundraising. But that we immediately then made a second application to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. When they gave us the grant for the first phase, they specifically said, we're looking forward to seeing your phase 2 application. So they seem to be very interested in this particular project. Throughout this process, Joan Weir with the Vermont Land Trust has been very helpful, very supportive. She's guided us through this Vermont Housing and Conservation Board process, and getting the easement placed on. We had to write an interim management plan to satisfy all the criteria that Vermont Housing and Conservation Board demanded. So it's been very interesting, it's been very educational, and Joan's been very helpful. I said I wanted to get back to the land. what we have is both sides are very steep. Down here we've got a lot of ledge outcroppings here, great rock climbing. I think Roger Haydock is going to talk about the geology of the land, but I'll just give a quick overview of the big picture, I guess, if you will. You can see that this phase 2, what we're calling the Mercedes Purchase, there's no, Putney Mountain Road is off the map up there. River Road runs along this side of the river. Winchester Stables are up here, if you're familiar. And there is a legal ford that is the access that when they hay the fields, they run right over the river. They have to pick a time when the river's low. So, of course, that made it less attractive to most buyers, but for us, that was great. And since we were working on buying this phase 1 parcel, which has access from Camp Arden Road, we knew that we could have hiking trails that would come over the top of the ridge and onto the other side. We have had Roger Haydock, is a incurable enthusiast when it comes to making hiking trails. I think he does it for his health. And so he laid this one out. The yellow line here is the trail that he's marked in, and it climbs 1,000 feet, but you wouldn't know it because he's carefully kept the gradient low, and some switchbacks and following contours. But when you come out on these power lines, I hadn't mentioned the power lines. They are a major feature of this land and of Putney Mountain. This is where the double 350 kilovolt line runs up to Cavendish. It runs right through the middle of the property. And this is the Green Mountain power line that goes to the substation behind Rick's Tavern. They're actually, as many people know, the habitat that they help sustain by keeping some open land and a kind of a shrub-scrub habitat that many animals, including bear, find what they need there. So we're actually finding the positive in that. The other thing that they create is incredible views. When you come out on the power line, this trail comes right out on a high ledge right up here where you can see the covered bridge looking south. You get a wide open view of the West River Valley. It's quite spectacular, and there's no other spot where you can get that view. So that's one of my favorite aspects. The other is that on the Mercedes land, right at this bend in the line, this is right where it heads down the other side. There's a very steep drop-off, and you can see the entire grassy Brook Valley and up the West River Valley. And you can see the whole Putney Mountain Ridge on your right. It's very spectacular. So we wouldn't have those without power lines. That's the big picture. That's our project. And thank you for listening. Yes. Hand it over to Roger to talk a little bit about the geology of the land.
So this is an aerial photo of Deer Run. Phase 2 is here. Phase 1 is here. How did this come to be? Well, let's take a look. And to answer this question, we need to go back 430 million years, okay? So imagine that we're right down here at the intersection of the Brock River and the West River, right there. 430 million years ago, where would we have been? We would have been in a submarine, because we would have had to be deep down in the deep ocean, believe it or not, in the southern hemisphere, about where Rio de Janeiro is today, thousands of feet down, where it's always dark, always cold, and what was below the submarine? Layer upon layer upon layer of different types of rock. Some types of rock had originated as clay, other types of rock had originated as volcanic eruptions, others had originated as gravels. They were laid down like a layer cake, and our submarine is resting on them, and they were minding their own business. But 400 million years ago, a landmass came from the east and pushed these originally layer cake rocks to where they folded upwards in these enormous upfolds. And that was the Athens Dome. Just to our northwest, huge mountains rose up as these originally flat rocks rose up like that. Off to our south was the Guilford Dome. It also bowed way upwards, and it came flopping over upside down. These originally flat rocks had been folded the way if you were a 10-year-old on a slippery floor with a rug sliding on the rug towards the couch, and all the rug flops over. That's what these rocks were doing. And in a down crease between the Athens Dome and the Guilford Dome, that is this Deer Run Ridge, which is the southern end of a long ridge going all the way up to Putney Mountain, all the way up to the Pinnacle in Westminster West, ultimately all the way to Cambridgeport. And so this was a huge mountain range. But what happens to mountain ranges when they get really high? Erosion, down they go. And over the next hundreds of millions of years, this land eroded down from being high mountains to where maybe 70 million years ago, and we don't really know the exact date, but maybe 70 million years ago, this land was pretty flat. Not completely flat, but pretty flat. Kind of like eastern Massachusetts today, around Boston. It's not absolutely dead flat. There's a few high hills like the Blue Hills or Mount Wachusett sticking up. And across this flat landscape, flowing from northwest to southeast, this landscape that had bedrock that was of different types, that was across that flat land. The different bedrocks, some were harder, some were softer. It didn't matter. The West River was flowing northwest to southeast across a pretty flat landscape on this route, and whether the rocks were hard or soft, it didn't make any difference. But when the land bowed upwards about 1,500 feet, maybe tens or 20s of millions of years ago, again, the dates are unclear, now the West River, which was a powerful river, it could keep eroding its way right through the hard rock here and not be bothered by the hard rock, because it could cut down as fast as the land was rising up. But other streams that existed when the land was flat couldn't cut down as fast as the land lifted up, and those streams had to erode out the soft rock places first and avoid eroding out the hard rock places. And so here's the West River. It's in a soft rock zone here that continues northwards in the Grassy Brook Valley, all the way up to Cambridgeport. That's because the bedrock was soft. Immediately to the east of it, there's hard bedrock. That forms the ridge of Deer Run, Putney Mountain, and the Windmill Hill Pinnacle. And so the reason that the ridge is there and the reason the valley is there is because of these different layers of rock that had started out 400 million years ago flat, but once they got tilted up as the bases of these big folds, you exposed these different layers, and so they determined the landscape shape, which looked maybe 5 million years ago not too different from today's landscape. But one difference that was around here 5 million years ago, soils were thicker, okay? Why did soils get thin between 5 million years ago and now? Because 2.5 million years ago or so, the climate started to get cooler. And as it got cooler, snow piled up in central Quebec. And once that snow got deep enough, it turned to ice. And when ice gets deeper than 50 or 100 feet thick, ice flows. It's not brittle anymore. And in the last 2.5 million years, there's been 16 separate ice advances and retreats. At least 4 of them reached this far south. And the biggest one reached down here 18 or 20,000 years ago at its maximum, when this land we're on was under thousands of feet of ice, where all of New England except Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket were under the ice. And that ice was slowly flowing southward, dragging with it the topsoil, the sands, the gravels, the boulders, everything, traveling down to Long Island and Cape Cod where it would melt out, and it created Long Island and Cape Cod. If you look at the eastern map of Long Island, there's like these 2 arms stretching out eastward. One of them is a glacial moraine deposit from 100 a little over 100,000 years ago. The other, the northern one, Orient Point, is from our most recent ice age, where it got to its southerly limit, kept bringing material which would melt out, get dumped, form hills that would keep the ice stuck there and just keep dumping and dumping and dumping. So basically, Long Island, Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket are all created by material that was stolen from northern New England and dumped down there. And so when we go on vacation to Cape Cod and stay at a motel and they charge us money, I'm sorry I hit the mic there, and they charge us money, this is our own land, okay? So, the ice peaked out about 20,000, 18,000 years ago, and then finally, the ice started melting back. And if you think of ice melting back, well, you would imagine the last place the ice would remain would be the high mountains, alpine glaciers. And sure enough, right in the presidential range of New Hampshire, Mount Washington, you have Tuckerman's Ravine, Huntington Ravine, Great Gulf. Those are glacially carved gulfs and ravines. And indeed, the very highest mountains retained glaciers for a long time. But around here, the place where the ice lasted longest was not the hilltops, even though they were higher. It was in the valleys. And why would that be? You'd think the valleys would be warmer, which they generally are. But the valleys are deeper. And because they're deeper, they can have thicker ice than on the hilltops. And so that thickness of the ice in the valleys gave a thermal mass, which was slower to cool down, slower to warm up. And therefore, the last place to melt out would be the valleys, so there'd be a big tongue of rotting ice here in the West River Valley. And if you imagine my arm as representing that ice in the valley, in the warmer months of the year, the ice would be melting and sand and gravel and stuff would be flowing off the edge of the ice onto the adjacent land. Also, erosion would be coming down from the hillsides, which at this point are tundra, right? Not trees yet. And so you would get these things called came deposits that would fill the land in between where the hills were and the ice. Some of the came deposit would be resting on the dry land, some would be supported by the ice itself. And then eventually the ice melted back and these came terraces were left behind on the hills. And the parts that had been on really solid ground were still pretty close to level in their appearance, but the ones that had been on ice had slumped because the ice was pulled away. So that gives you the highest terraces that you would find on our land. And right here on phase 1, there is a came terrace that's been clearly identified. The next thing that happened is as the ice was melting backwards, northwards, it didn't all disappear at once. And so it was producing huge amounts of melt water, which created a proglacial lake called Glacial Lake Hitchcock, which ran ultimately from south of Hartford, Connecticut, all the way up to St. Johnsbury, Vermont, and also ran up the tributary river valleys like the West River or the Deerfield River, the White River. And so this would have been Glacial Lake Hitchcock here, a long lake extending up just a few miles above what this map shows. And alongside the edge of that lake, you would have shoreline deposits. You would have sands in some places. You would get little stream deltas coming in, and where the stream would come down off the hilltop, it would hit the still water of the lake and deposit its sands and gravels, which would slowly extend out into the lake, creating a delta. Then Glacial Lake Hitchcock drained, maybe in the 12,000 year ago range. And when that happened, finally, the West River could reclaim its rightful place in its own river valley. And as it did so, at first it was flowing in the bottom of Glacial Lake Hitchcock material. But you know we get big floods every so often, an Irene or some huge spring flood or whatever. And so because the glacial lake deposits were soft material, when you got those big floods, it would wash out a lot of that river or lake bottom material, creating a floodplain for the West River. And so it would have left behind the lake bottom. Now it's got a new floodplain. Come back in 100 years, you get another storm like Irene, you drop down the river to a new floodplain, leaving a terrace behind. Then another 100 years or 200 years, another big catastrophic flood dropping down to a new floodplain, leaving behind yet another terrace. And so gradually you would create a stair-step pattern of these terraces dropping down towards the center of the river valley until finally you are where we are now, where we have a present-day floodplain here and here, and the river's rate of erosion is now way slowed down because it's hit bedrock. So it's going to be still cutting down, but not too fast. Basically, from about this point southwards on the West River, the gradient for the next 9 kilometers is twice as steep as it is the gradient for the 12 kilometers going upstream. So there's a bedrock control in here that's keeping the river from eroding as fast in this area of hard bedrock. So that takes us pretty close to where we are now, but there's one piece of active erosion that's still happening here on the outside of this curve of the West River, kind of across from the Newfane School. It's so steep in here that there are landslides that are active right now. They're very slow motion, I think, but they're happening. And you can see that if you walk through the woods there, it's very, very steep, but there's many scars of many landslides that have occurred over many centuries. The trees have sort of regrown back into them to stabilize them, but this is an actively eroding area right now. And that's the geology of Deer Run.
So I'm going to show you some pictures from this new Phase 2 area that when you're coming north on Route 30 and you pass the covered bridge, as you look straight up the highway and you see a hillside, that's the Phase 1, 287 acres of Deer Run Nature Preserve. This is a hillside from River Road, the southwestern portion of the hillside. This is the West River with the new Phase 2 parcel across the river. This is the ford. You can see kind of in the center there, a faint track. And if you look at that rock that's just in front of that, I'm told by John Cutler, who hays it, if you see that rock when you're going across, you're okay. If you don't see that rock, you might want to wait till another time to cross the ford. There are a couple of agricultural things that happen here on the land. This is Maple Row Farm off of River Road. And this is not part of what we're buying for Deer Run Nature Preserve, but you can see the haying equipment. There's about 47 acres of hayfield that's actively hayed. And there are also, there's a sugar bush up there, and the pipeline comes down across the West River. If you go to Google Earth, you can actually see the pipeline on the map going across the river. And the hillside also is the backdrop for Newbrook School. That hillside there is part of the future Deer Run Nature Preserve lands. And if you're on the opposite shore, opposite bank, up near the top, you can look back, and if the leaves are off the trees, you can see Newbrook Elementary School across the river. In that area, there is a grove of Shagbark Hickory, and the hickory are fairly unusual for this area. One of the creatures that uses the Shagbark Hickory is the Indiana bat, and that's one of the bats that was severely affected by white nose syndrome because they winter in caves, but they come out, they spread out over the landscape for this summer, and we're hopeful that there may be some here and that it will at least provide a refuge if that population rebounds. There are also some unique natural areas. This is most likely a red oak, a dry red oak white pine habitat that looks like a savanna. There are, of course, a variety of trees. We can see the black birch and the beech and the hemlock here, small streams that drain the area, old maples, And of course, we have to have stone walls. And you'll see the hemlock trunks there. There are a number of deer wintering yards in the parcel, vernal pools. There's at least one seep. This is a kind of unusual area. You don't know quite where the water's coming from or where it goes, but it's wet. And this is a unique area for us now because these lands were cleared and then grew up again. We don't really know what kind of natural succession might take place in the plants. But the Vermont Land Trust is interested in studying these areas, and it may be that we'll be able to participate in a study which would fence off this kind of area from browsing by deer so that over time we could see what kind of changes happen in this seep area. As I said, there is a sugaring operation up on the hillside. This is at the top. There are views from the power lines. You can see down to Dutton's farm, and you can see up the Grassy Brook Valley. There are a couple of birch groves. Hunting will continue to be permitted on the land. And this is kind of an odd one. Mary Ellen, what flower is this?
Herb Robert.
Herb Robert. Now this is up way at the top, and this is not a native plant, and it was flowering on November 2nd. And this is the last slide of a very curious Shagbark Hickory that's up on the top of the ridge. So I hope you'll all be able to get a chance to get up there and take a look at some of this.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joan Weir with the Vermont Land Trust, and as Sam mentioned earlier in the evening, I've been working with the Green Mountain Conservancy for over a year, helping them get through all the various phases of working on a conservation project. And the amazing thing about this group is this is the first project they ever worked on, and to get a project of this scale done in 1 year's time is pretty amazing. So kudos to the Green Mountain Conservancy. So as Sam mentioned, we just completed phase 1, which is the 287 acres formerly owned by the Wilson brothers. And the Green Mountain Conservancy raised money not only for the acquisition of the land, but for all of the associated closing and conservation costs. So it's important to realize that a conservation project has multiple components in terms of building a budget for the actual project. Sam mentioned that they relied on the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board as a major funding source, and they hope to go back to that source for phase 2. And I wanted to just explain how that works. So in exchange for getting a sizable grant, so in the case of the first one, it was $150,000. I think for phase 2, it's about $280,000 they're hoping to receive from the state. The state requires that the applicant work with a nonprofit such as the Vermont Land Trust to actually hold the conservation easement on the property. So in exchange for getting the money, the owner has to partner up with a nonprofit like the Vermont Land Trust. So as much as we all get along well and and things have worked, so far, the point being is that, with the sizable chunks of money come the requirement that you really need to work with an organization that will guide you through this process and basically get all the legal aspects of this work done. So there is this requirement that a conservation easement be placed on the property. So not only does Green Mountain Conservancy own the land, but they have conveyed a conservation easement held by the Vermont Land Trust and the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And so what is the essence of that agreement? What is that all about? It means that the Green Mountain Conservancy has agreed to keep the land undeveloped, that is, no further subdivision. In this case, it's open to the public for recreational access, and important natural features are going to be protected and well managed. It does allow for Green Mountain Conservancy to use the land for forestry, for agriculture, for non-commercial recreation, education. So there certainly are uses that can continue to happen on the property, but for the most part, there will be no future development. And so all of that is described in this legal agreement called the Conservation Easement, and that's a perpetual easement. It's part of the deed and is recorded in the town offices. The Vermont Land Trust then takes on the responsibility to steward that easement, and annually will meet with the landowner to ensure that the easement is being upheld and that there are no violations. So it's a very long-term partnership that the Green Mountain Conservancy has put in place. So that is in the case of phase 1, which we've just completed, and then moving towards phase 2. The Vermont Land Trust will basically play a very similar role going forward. So what we provide really is help with publicity and outreach. So tonight is a good example of trying to educate people that live in the communities about the conservation project so that they can learn about what the work is and ultimately potentially support the project going forward. We help the Green Mountain Conservancy basically go through the VHCB application process if the money is granted, helping them to administer the grant. Sam mentioned that we do ecological studies, so we have an ecologist on our staff that will go out onto the properties and do an assessment, and with that information that helps to determine what particular resources will get extra protection. All of that feeds into the conservation easement. We draft the conservation easement, again, with the Green Mountain Conservancy. We do mapping, baseline documentation work. Sam mentioned we, in this case, needed to develop an interim management plan, so we're looking to what are going to be some of the first steps that happen now that it's under new ownership. What are their plans? So all of this then concludes into a legal closing. So there's a lot of work, legal and conservation-related hoops that have to be, dealt with to sort of get to the other side of concluding a conservation project. And the Vermont Land Trust has been here to guide them through that and to help them. And we've been successful so far, and looking forward to working with the group going forward. I guess I'll leave it at that, and if people have questions later, I'm happy to answer any questions that people have about conservation easements.
Hi, I'm Marie Levette Caduto. I work for the Department of Environmental Conservation as the watershed coordinator for this region. So my work is basically rivers, lakes, streams, water quality, aquatic habitat. So when the Conservancy folks got in touch with me about a letter of support for their next grant, and I looked at what you were looking to conserve, I got really excited about it, because this is really an amazing property, and I'm really psyched to see that you guys are working on it. So I'm going to be really creative and show you the exact same image 10 times. That's what you're going to see. So these are all the parcels around this region, so go ahead and hit that. And obviously you know which parcels you're looking at to conserve. But when you start looking at the finer detail on what's here, what is it that you're protecting on this, and every piece of this information you can look at online on our Natural Resources Atlas. So it's all here. And these are just the different layers of information on natural resources that we have. So the olive green are wetlands that are already mapped. The paler green behind some of them, excuse me, are wetlands that we know about but aren't fully mapped. The green squares with little frogs on them are vernal pools that we know and are confirmed to exist. And the red ones we know are there, but they just haven't been completely confirmed by, let's call them, other professionals. So when you start looking, and the dark blue lines obviously are water, streams, rivers, and this being the west, as I'm sure you see, coming up around the property, Grassy Brook, Smith Brook coming in opposite the property, and this is the Rock River. So all of these are impacting this property, and this property is impacting a lot of what's around it. When you start looking at more detail, this is what's called a LiDAR image. It's a very specific elevation shot of the land, and you can see that it's not level, as Roger has indicated. I was looking at it and wondering what that was, so you just explained that. I appreciate knowing what that is. So if you hit it one more time, all of these are also water paths. So it's not just the big blue lines. There's a lot of water coming off that hillside. It's really steep. There's a lot coming down. So there's a lot of water resources that will be protected on this property. If you look at the color of the river on this one, it turned to orange. And the whole thing from the bottom, the mouth of the West River in Brattleboro, all the way up to the dams. Water quality-wise, we term the river as stressed, because although it still meets our state water quality standards, it's kind of on the border. And the reason for that is because of the impacts that the Army Corps dams, Ball Mountain and Townsend, actually have on the river and the water quality and the aquatic habitat that happens in the West River. So we know that the habitat of the aquatic habitat along the West River is stressed because they hold back water, they release water. The water in the reservoirs get hot and then it passes through. So there's a lot of this temperature issues, there's flow issues, and every time that happens, the aquatic organisms are impacted by those changes. So protecting 2.5 miles of riparian habitat and shoreline habitat on the West River is amazing. We don't have that opportunity very often. And that will help improve the conditions of the plans that are made to manage this property can impact that pretty dramatically. The other piece of it is that this parcel is mapped floodplain. So the red and this funky orange is I'm sure you've heard the term 100-year floodplain. So that's the 100-year floodplain of the West River. And I didn't realize Smith Brook had a mapped floodplain. That's interesting to me. The tan area is what we call the river corridor. And that's not floodplain. That's, see, I'm going to contradict you here. And I'm going to say the river is going to move. Because through the flat floodplain area here, the river is always moving. And that band of tan is where we know that over time, mathematically, the river is going to move. Because it's floodplain, it's those soft erodible soils. The next flood, as you saw in Irene, the river path changes. And that is the area that we expect over time that river will move around in. So none of that is officially stable for the long term. Protecting it from further development is important for the floodplain itself, for health and safety, for property, all those things. So there's other reasons to protect it than strictly the the critters and trees that live there. And these are the critters and trees that live there. So all the colored spots are documented areas, not exact locations, of things that we are trying to protect. So the first ones, go ahead and hit something. So there are, right in this region, there are 3 separate species of freshwater mussels that are either threatened or of concern. That means species of greatest conservation need. And there's wood turtles, which are also special conservation need, all within just this area. One of these spots is one of these critters. There's also some really amazing plants, and the most particular one is the Barbed Bristled Bulrush, which is shown over there. That's all right. You got the map, that's what's important. That is a federally and state globally endangered species, and it occurs in southeastern Vermont only. So this is the area for that one to be found, and it has been found in this region. So obviously they're seeds, they get transferred by birds and all kinds of other critters, so when it's in the region, we want to protect those habitats. 2 different kinds of orchids being threatened, and also, I just picked a few of a long list of plant species that are important to conserve in this area. And then there's 2 actual important kind of rare natural communities, the red spruce cinnamon fern swamp and the river cobble shore. And this little tiny purple thing at the end is the river cobble shore. And being a river person, that particular habitat is really important because there are other endangered species that live only in that river shore cobble habitat, like the cobblestone tiger beetle. And though that is another federally endangered species that we have. So all these pieces put together, there's a lot of important animals and plants that we can be protecting in this region. And when you kind of look at the land, we're talking about connections and connectivity. So the dark spots are permanently conserved either by federal or state or like the land trust, Vermont Land Trust. The hatched marks are all under current use. And from my perspective, that is a form of protection. It's not going to be converted to houses. It's not going to be broken up unless somebody goes through a process to do that. So when you look at that and how this parcel fits in, you can see the connections between those larger blocks of habitat. And the 2 that I'm pointing out are important from my perspective is because they're cross-river connections, which are harder to make. When you have conserved land on both sides of a major river, this whole area, you're connecting things that want to cross the river or are in the river and need to be able to move to other rivers. So those 2 particular connections I find really important and really good reasons that this parcel sits in a great spot. You put all that together and you can kind of see where this is a hub. This is a real kind of crux property that fits into a much larger picture of a lot of different pieces of conservation need. And I don't know if I have another slide or not. I think I do. Oh yeah, I put this one in too. So if you can go ahead and hit it twice. And as people have mentioned, that's a 75-acre floodplain. Just that flat area. And that's a significant size floodplain for the Upper West River watershed. There's not a lot of those that can be conserved. They're either developed or they're in, full-blown agriculture, or this is a really important floodplain. What happens We call it a floodplain because when the water rises, the water spreads out, fills that area. What that does is provides room for the water to move, slows it down, all the sediment and everything else drops out, and it slows the water down as it passes downstream. So the next community down isn't hammered by all that extra water being caught in the channel. So we call these pressure relief valves on the river. Every time you have a floodplain that can flood, it takes the water, spreads it out, slows it down, and makes it less damaging as the river progresses downstream. So that, the 2.5 miles of West River shoreline is phenomenal to be able to protect that much. And then on the other side, so the one recommendation I have, and there's only one, is to increase the width of that buffer along the field. That's the buffer, the vegetation along the riverbank is crucial to stability of the bank, because all those roots form a network that hold the soil in place so it's less erodible. It also protects the field if you're going to continue agriculture, because as the trees get larger, all the stuff that comes down the river in a flood, the trees, the boulders, they get caught in that net of tree stumps. So they're not inundating the field. The water inundates the field and the sediment, but the bigger stuff doesn't necessarily get through the trees. It's also the wildlife corridor. When the wildlife have that cover along the riverbank, they're much more likely to move through it and find those connections. So all these different pieces together, from my perspective, make this a really unique and important property to conserve.
So, I hope you've all learned a lot about this really fantastic piece of property. And even with all you've seen, until you've actually walked on it, until you've been on it, just the sense of it is just really special, really magical for all of the reasons that you've heard and many more. In order to do this is a big project. We've only done one project so far. It's gone very well. We're gonna need a lot of help. So if you would like to volunteer, if you would like to be considered for a member of the Green Mountain Conservancy Board, please let us know. There's papers in the back. Give us your email address and we can keep you updated on what's happening, or give us your mail address if you don't do email, and we can keep you updated on what's going on and keep you involved. We just would like your help, because this is going to take a lot of work, and you can all see that it's really special. So